Hey everyone, this is Dr. C, and I am pretend giving you this week's lecture from the Basilica Santa Maria Exaladora y San Carlos in Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is actually the basilica over here where Pope Francis was baptized as a baby. So I thought it would be an interesting setting for our discussion today of the Salem Witch Trials. So the Salem Witch Trials were really America's version of the European witch hysterics. So let's look at some of the interesting conditions in colonial America at the time that contributed to the Salem witch hysteria. So first off, when we talk about the Salem witch trials, you would assume that they happen in Salem, but they actually don't. So there's Salem town, which is what is today Salem, Massachusetts, the main village in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. People in Salem didn't get along very well, so a lot of them ended up moving to a village just outside of it, which is today Danvers, Massachusetts. And that was Salem Village. So Salem Village was already full of the assholes to begin with. So you can take a wild guess as to where the Salem witch trials actually started, and that's in Salem Village. And in Salem Village, there is constant infighting. There are property disputes, families don't get along with each other, there's a lot of jealousy, there's a lot of social disruption. So unsurprisingly, a lot of the social tensions that we come to expect in witchcraft situations applied to Salem society. The entire Massachusetts Bay Colony was Protestant, and they were puritanical, and that's a very strict form of the Protestant religion. It is focused on creating that godly society. These are people who fled the Counter-Reformation or the 30 Years' War because they were too Protestant even for the Protestants. So these are already people who are kind of judgy and up their own asses all the time. And then the ones who couldn't fit together with the judgy people all went and formed their own village that was super judgy. And that's the setting of the Salem witch trial. And let's look a little bit at New England politics. So this is colonial America. This is not the United States yet. And so colonies were held under charter to the crown. There were French colonies under charter to the French crown. We're interested in the New England colony, so obviously New England. But these villages were predominantly under the control of local leadership. The king was not involved in the Salem witch trials at all. Royal authority wasn't involved. This was all a hot mess that happened on our side of the pond. So local leadership was in charge. We really can't underestimate the harsh realities of life in rural Puritan communities in Salem Village. We're talking about extremely different ecological conditions where people didn't have great shelter, they didn't have great clothing, they were living out in the elements. A really bad winter storm could destroy an entire colony. In addition, there was the British War with the French in these American colonies in the 1680s, which affected social standings and tensions in the region. There were smallpox epidemics all of the time, conflicts with Native American groups, including rivalries with tribal leaders, etc. So where did ideas of witchcraft in New England actually come from? Well, unsurprisingly, they were brought over from Europe. So the pre-existing European witch trials in the 1500s created that or contributed to that environment, that crisis mentality, where people were afraid of conversing with the devil, women who were improper or impure, the moral anxieties that come from social tensions. All of those existed in Europe, and they were just brought over with them to the colonies. And it's not like the Salem witch trials were the first ones. There had already been individual and medium-sized hunts that occurred in Connecticut, as well as Providence. Providence is the colony that eventually becomes Rhode Island. These kind of small-scale hunts we talked about in Europe, where one individual is killed or 5 or 6 people and then it dies down. The Salem witch trials are important because they're one of those massive mega hunts. They are the largest example of the witch hunts in colonial New England, but they certainly aren't the only, and they certainly weren't the first. As a matter of fact, the minister Cotton Mather, who was a famous philosopher and minister in New England at the time, actually wrote one of the best compendiums about witchcraft, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Their Possessions, in which he talks about the use of black magic and diabolism, but he also argues against the use of spectral evidence, arguing that actual physical evidence is necessary. He even argues, look, I'm putting this a bit colloquially, but I would rather have 10 witches not found guilty than to have an innocent person found guilty by accident. So he was really an advocate of very strong and rigorous standards for determining whether they're witches. This will come up more later when we talk about the Salem example. But there was already a discourse about witchcraft occurring in colonial New England before the Salem witch trials even happened. So let me break down some of the events that occurred during the Salem witch trials. So in January of 1692, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams start having fits. Now, they're cousins. They live together in the same house. They both have access to the same slave tituba. So they start having fits, like violent contortions, outbursts of screaming, eyes rolling in the back of their head, like some vomiting. I mean, we're talking some wild stuff. The local doctor is like, I can't find anything physically wrong with them. I think they're bewitched. And then lo and behold, as the month progresses, these girls are getting a lot of attention. Other girls in the village start getting jealous, so they start to exhibit similar symptoms. 3 first arrest warrants that came out in February were 3 women that were kind of on the periphery of the community and were connected already to pre-existing social tensions. So these 3 accused witches were brought before some magistrates and they were questioned in March. Once again, their accusers appear in court. They are screaming, they're writhing, they're showing spasms, they're having contortions. And then the actual confessions start. And Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, the first 2 women, were like, nope, nope, nope. We had absolutely nothing to do with this. We do not know what's going on. But Tituba, who probably wanted to be sure that she wasn't executed and thought, hey, if I give up information on the other 2, I might not be executed. She starts making confessions, and we are talking wild confessions. Like, the devil came up to me. He was dressed as an elderly man. He had a black dog and a red dog and a black cat and a red cat. At one point, she describes the devil bringing a figure which has long legs and wings in the face of a woman. So she basically describes as Strix without realizing it. And that these animals and the devil figure forced her to torture the girls. She also claims that the devil showed her a book of all of the other witches, and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were in that book. And she also, Tituba says that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were with the devil doing witchy things. So she basically points the finger at everyone else. But most importantly, she gives like a wild and crazy description. All of the color and excitement, like everything that people wanted to hear. Like, she understood what people want to hear. She gave them what they wanted in the hopes that they would basically leave her alone. It colors and shapes the entire witch hunt. Like, people start looking for the things that she's describing because that makes sense. The court believes her because she's a slave, and she says, look, a white man made me do it. And they go, well, it's not her fault. She had to obey the devil, etc. The trial starts to get out of hand. More and more people start being accused. And as a result, the trials end up having to expand. So by late May, the witch trials have gotten out of hand. It started in Salem. There are only 3 witches. Then Tituba's like, oh, let me tell you all the things to look for witches. So then people start looking for those things. And the next thing you know, we've got about 100 people, both men and women, who have been arrested. One of the first 3 witches has already died in jail, right? I mean, this is now, we're a couple months into it. And like, we're not talking about jails like with beds and stuff. We're literally talking about like a stone room, and you get like a bucket of slop to eat, and if it's winter, like, you're gonna die, right? So one of the witches already died in custody. Like, oh, there you go, right? And witches start being blamed for everything. They start being blamed for smallpox when there's a smallpox breakout that year. All of the physical maladies that come from winter and spring start being blamed, and then their accomplices, and then the blame spreads. And then people in the next village over, right? And at this point, we actually start seeing documents being written by Cotton Mather and other ministers of the area that's like, hey, don't even go into these villages because we do not know what's going on with all these witches, and we need to sort this out. So it gets so large that the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, right, Governor Phipps, basically goes, look, we have to have a special trial. Like, we can't have our regular courts handling this because it's overwhelming them. Let's have a court of oyer and terminer. Oyer to listen, terminer to get information and determine things. And then most of the evidence in the Salem witch trials came from spectral evidence. So what is spectral evidence? That is evidence gathered in a dream. So I had a vision that that woman was a witch, was taken as evidence and proof, legal, scientific proof that that woman was a witch because I saw it in a dream, which, like, I don't know about you, but wow, I can dream about all sorts of things. That doesn't automatically make them true, right? But at this time, there was the belief that dreams were visions that were given to you by God. And therefore, God was trying to give you like a hint, like, holy shit, this person's a witch, be careful. So this was valid scientific evidence. There were also some other forms of evidence that were particularly interesting. One of these is the witch cake. So the witch cake was a form, a test of witchcraft, where if somebody was a victim of witchcraft, so for example, if one of the girls was spasming and freaking out and having all of these adverse physical effects, you would take her urine, you would mix it with rye, you would bake it into what was clearly the nastiest fucking cake you could come up with, and then you fed it to a dog. The dog, because it was possessed by the urine of the victim, would go and sniff out the witch that had caused the victim to be sick in the first place. In other words, the witchcraft was like in the victim's urine, and now it was in the dog, and the dog could smell where it came from. And then, of course, there was lots of evidence from torture. So we torture you, we get a confession out of you, there you go, that's proof. So the trials continued from May all the way through September, and the governor is made aware of them through letters from Cotton Mather. So Cotton Mather provides a lot of our unbiased testimonies about the trials. By October, Governor Phipps is like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, a lot of people have been convicted, and we are doing a lot of executions. This is a little bit problematic. The next year, the main prosecutor, William Stockton, who's like, no, I'm not done yet. There are people to execute, yo. He starts a new court, which Governor Phipps then has to shut down. And Phipps just basically pardons everybody and demands that the trial stops. And it's like, this has gotten out of hand. For the love of God, just stop it. So the trials stop by mid-1693. By this point, several people have been executed, most of them by hanging. There is an example of one guy who is smushed by a stone. So what they do is they tie him down just lying on his back, and they put a giant stone on his chest, and then everybody sat there and waited until he stopped breathing. So the heavy stone just gradually crushed his lungs until he couldn't breathe anymore, and he couldn't catch his breath, and he suffocated to death. And then there also were several witches, both prosecuted and found guilty, and then also just that were still waiting for trial, who ended up dying in prison because, like I said, these are not nice prisons. Phipps ends up pardoning everybody, and the last who is pardoned is Tituba. She does survive. She's the only one of the 3 original witches who survives. So it turns out ratting everybody else out was the way to go. She escapes and goes back to the Barbados with whoever ends up freeing her from prison. So one of the arguments on why the Salem witch trials happens actually has nothing to do with the idea of mass hysteria and social tension and crisis, but has to do with ergot. So you guys did the reading from Alan Wolfe for this week, and he talks about ergot being important in actually causing the witch trials. So make sure you do the Wolfe reading off of perusal, and keep these questions in mind when you do that reading so that we can discuss it in section better. And so what is the aftermath of the Salem witch trials? All of the trials were ended by mid-1693. Many of the people who were convicted and managed to survive got reprieves and had their innocence declared. In fact, several victims actually got financial compensation during their lives from the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Many of the descendants of people who were executed as witches still advocate for the innocence of their ancestors. And today, you can actually visit both Salem, which is Salem town, and Danvers, which was where Salem Village was and where this whole thing started. This is also a good time to think about the legacy of Tituba. All right, that was quite a long one, but now we should have a clear understanding of the Salem witch trials. Thank you so much for listening, and I cannot wait to discuss this further in section.